So I'm going to give this talk today, and I have a trouble sticking to script, so you'll have to forgive me. I tend to wander off. But what I also find the best way is I'm not used to speaking to classrooms anymore. I started off my career years ago when I first came to Canada as a lecturer at McGill University in geography. That's probably the last time I really taught a student class, right? But I much prefer it to, after the presentation, to really have a conversation about Canada. And what I find is when I do these kinds of dialogues, that's when the richness of the ideas really come across. Because there's no way in one presentation you can cover everything. But by people asking questions and feeling comfortable asking questions, I find it really makes people comfortable and lead to a really good dialogue. And remember, there is no stupid question. There is no dumb question. Every question is really important and worthwhile. So I hope you feel comfortable as we go through this at the end to talk a little about it. So what I'm going to talk about just now is really the relationship that we have, Canada and the United States. And as you can see, we are very similar, but we have slight differences in how we look at the world. I still when I phone, and somebody asked me the name, my wife's name is Feroza, and I spell it P-H-E-R-O-Z-A. And when I say that over the phone, I get this kind of baffled sort of sound. I'm thinking, well, I should say Z instead of Z, P-H-E-R-O-Z-A. So we have a lot of similarities, but we are also different. But it's a very important relationship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the formal presentation. I'm just going to talk about energy. In South Dakota, this is a very important piece, as you well know, in terms of the Canadian involvement in energy in South Dakota and the certain pipelines and stuff. So I thought it'd be worthwhile really sort of talking about that. But then really having a conversation about the rest of Canada. I'm also very pleased here tonight to have people who are Canadian, who lived in Canada, who have an interest in Canada, been to Canada lots of times, who I'm sure will correct me when I go wrong. And this is wrong, Judge, so don't feel shy to say that. Okay? And so I hope you have fun. And so really, first and foremost, I think Canada and the United States are friends. There's a real friendship there. And when I've sort of lived here, and by the way, as Consul General, I'm responsible for, I'm essentially Canada's senior representative, so I'm Canada's ambassador for the upper Midwest, which is Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. And when I travel in my area, and I do that, I try to do that a lot. I really find there's a genuine sense of we're friends, a genuine friendship, and the same in Canada when you talk to Canadians about Americans and coming to America. There's a real comfort in the sense of being together as sort of that friendship, and it really is very important. So as that quote says, by Prime Minister, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. While a border defines two people, it does not need to divide us. And I'm going to give you a little quiz, because you are in a university and you do take exams all the time and tests. So I have a question for you to ponder on, and at the end, I'll show you my answer, and then we can have a conversation about that if you like. So think about this. What are the two phrases, one on the Canadian side, one on the American side, that you think define what the United States is all about, and what Canada is all about, and how that makes us different, but also similar? So think about that. What are the two defining phrases? Or a series of words, there are not too many words, that sort of define what it is to be American, and one phrase, and what is the other phrase that defines what it means to be Canadian. And then we'll sort of talk about it. So I'll have my answer, my version, at the end. You can see if I'm right or not. Okay, so you've got to do that, okay, because you're all that from a university, or most of you have related to university kind of things. I'm also now going to show you a little a video if I don't screw up here. And what it's about is about the border, and it's kind of amusing because it really shows how, when you talk about borders and security, sometimes how arbitrary things can be. Okay, so bear with me if I get it right. Oh, I did get it right. Amazing.
Share the longest, straightest, possibly boringest border in the world. But look closer, and there's plenty of bizarreness to be found. While these sister nations get along fairly well, they both want to make it really clear whose side of the continent is whose, and they've done this by carving a 20-foot wide space along the border, all 5.5 8,000 miles of it. With the exception of the rare New England town that predates national borders or the odd airport that needed expanding, this space is the no-touching zone between the countries, and they're super serious about keeping it clear. It matters not if the no-touching zone runs through hundreds of miles of virtually uninhabited Alaskan Yukon wilderness, those border trees will not stand. Which might make you think this must be the longest, straightest deforested place in the world, but it isn't. Deforested, yes, but straight, not at all. Sure, it looks straight on a map, and the treaties establishing the line say it's straight, but in the real world, the official border is 900 lines that zigzag from the horizontal by as much as several hundred feet. How did this happen? Well, imagine you're back in North America in the 1800s. The 49th parallel, one of those horizontal lines you see on the globe, has just been set as the national boundary, and it's your job to make it real. You are handed a compass and a ball of string and told to carefully mark off the next 2/3 of a continent. Don't mind that uncharted wilderness in your way, just keep the line straight. Yeah, good luck with that. The men who surveyed the land did the best they could and built over 900 monuments. They're in about as straight a line as you could expect a pre-GPS civilization to make, but it's not the kind of spherical planar intersection that would bring a mathematician joy. Nonetheless, these monuments define the border, and the no-touching zone plays connect the dots with them. Oh, and while there are about 900 markers along this section of the border, there are about 8,000 in total that define the shape of the nations. Despite this massive project, Canada and the United States still have disputed territory. There's a series of islands in the Atlantic that the United States claims are part of Maine, and Canada claims are part of New Brunswick. Canada, assuming the islands are hers, built a lighthouse on one of them, and the United States, assuming the islands are hers, pretends the lighthouse doesn't exist. As the argument is mostly over tourists who want to see puffins and fishermen who want to catch lobsters, but let's hope the disagreement gets resolved before someone finds oil under that lighthouse. And the non-disputed territory has a few notably weird spots, such as this tick of the border upward into Canada. Zoom in and it gets stranger as the border isn't over solid land, but runs through a lake to cut off a bit of Canada before diving back down to the US. This spot is home to about 100 Americans and is a perfect example of how border irregularities are born. Back in 1783, when the victorious Americans were negotiating with the British, who controlled what would one day be Canada, they needed a map, and this map was the best available at the time. While the East Coast looks pretty good, the wester it goes, the sparser it gets. Under negotiation was the edge of what would one day be Minnesota and Manitoba, but unfortunately that area was hidden underneath an inset on the map, so the border blind. Seriously. They guessed the border should start from the northwestern part of this lake and go in a horizontal line until it crossed the Mississippi, somewhere. But somewhere turned out to be nowhere, as the mighty Mississippi stopped short of that line, which left the border vague until 35 years later, when a second round of negotiations established the aforementioned 49th parallel. But there was still a problem, as the lake mentioned earlier was both higher and less circular than first thought, putting its northwesterly point here, so the existing border had to jump up to meet it and then drop straight down to the 49th, awkwardly cutting off a bit of Canada before heading west to the remainder of the continent. And it turns out you can't just draw a straight-ish line for hundreds of miles without causing a few more problems. One of which was luckily spotted in advance, Vancouver Island, which the 49th would have sliced through, but both sides agreed that would be dumb, so the border swoops around the island. However, next door to Vancouver Island is Point Roberts, which went unnoticed, and thus today the border blithely cuts across. It's a nice little town home to over 1,000 Americans, but has only a primary school, so its older kids have to cross international borders 4 times a day, which is cool for the state. In pleasing symmetry, the East Coast has the exact opposite situation, with a Canadian island whose only land route is a bridge from the United States. And these two are the only places where each country contains a bit of the other. There are several more, easily spotted in satellite photos by the no-touching zone. Regardless of if the land in question is just an uninhabited strip in the middle of a lake in the middle of nowhere, the border between these sister nations must remain clearly marked. Hello, Internet. If you're a super map geek like me, you can click on the link on the side and you can go to...
Oh. So anyway, so that shows you the border, and the example about in British Columbia and in Washington about the school kids having to cross the border 4 times a day. That actually even happens in the Northwest Angle piece, where if you're a kid, US kid living in the Northwest Angle, you have to sort of leave the United States, cross into Canada, re-enter. So you go through one border crossing into Canada, and then you re-enter the United States in a place called Warroad in Minnesota, and you go through and then you go to school, spend your day, and you come back the other way around. So you're crossing the border 4 times. And it's, as you can imagine, the schools start up pretty early, right? So these kids get up quite early. They had to get up earlier because they, at every border they stop, their vehicles checked and stuff like that. It drives people, as you can imagine, up the wall, like kind of frustration. So sometimes my job is to go and work with people and help them, both the people like the parents, as the people who live there, work with our border security agencies, and force on both sides. So, come on, guys and ladies, how can we actually do something that's realistic and reasonable on that? But it is a lot of fun, and but that really does show us that there is a lot of how we think of ourselves and our borders. There is a lot of flexibility there. But one of the key parts of the piece over the time is that the two countries, and we're not only close friends, but we really are tied together in a symbiotic relation in one of the most complex and important trading relationships in the world. It's a huge relationship that every day, $2 billion worth of goods and services cross our kind of irregular border every single day. That's over $700 billion a year, or roughly about $1.4 million per minute crosses our borders. And that really not just keeps Canada functioning, it keeps the economy in the United States functioning. It means about 8 million jobs in the United States depend on that trade and investment in Canada. It's an equally huge number of jobs in Canada depend on the trade with the United States. And widely, all countries, we have to look at parts of the world, we have to grow our economies. We want to look at expanding and looking at China, to Brazil, India, all of those countries, the G20 countries, we have to do that. That's the roots of it. The trade, we have the biggest markets for each other's goods. And so it's a very important relationship, and that's part of why I'm here in Minneapolis, along with I have 11 other colleagues around the United States and offices. It's really to keep nurturing that trade investment, make sure it continues to grow, because not just the country's wealth, which is important, but when you bring it down, it's the prosperity of individual Canadians, individual Americans, it's the prosperity of people living in small towns, communities like Brookings or the Imperial towns of Canada, who depend on those the jobs and the wages that those that investment and trade creates. But I'm always going the wrong way there. So when you bring it down, you think about South Dakota in that part. So when you think about it, in South Dakota, 25,000 jobs in South Dakota depend on trade with Canada. It's quite a huge amount, and Canada is by far South Dakota's largest customer for products. A lot of agricultural materials. So we purchase. When you export, 45% of your exports from South Dakota go into Canada. It is that big. That trade is that important to South Dakota. And our role is to continue to make that happen. So for example, earlier today when I came down in the meeting, I was talking to some folks from the South Dakota soybean processors. And they're telling me that their supply soybean meal into British Columbia, British Columbia in the Abbotsford, that we have a very intensive agriculture there, where a lot of poultry and dairy is produced, and most of the feed that agriculture industry in British Columbia depends on actually comes from right here, from some mills right just north of town here. So it's that important, that kind of trade. It happens day after day. Kind of quite quietly, you don't see them in terms of massive amounts of trucks moving forward, trains going back and forth. It is that an important piece for us. And it's not just goods and services to people. So about almost 200,000 Canadians come to South Dakota every year to visit, to spend money in South Dakota. The same kind of thing, not as many South Dakotas go to Canada, but there's a significant amount of South Dakotas go to Canada as well. It is that relationship that really makes it important for us, and to really work together as two countries, because it's in our mutual interest to maintain that trading relationship and maintain that value. and then, as part of that, one of the key parts of that trading relationship is really around energy. And over time, the integrated nature of the energy network has really sort of flourished, and it's energy in all its forms, all the way from oil and gas, which we talk about, to electricity, to nuclear. So it's a real dependence there. And just on the electricity, for example, quite a few years ago now, must be about 10 years ago, there was a massive power failure on the East Coast, created by some sort of fault in a transmission line in Ohio, but it brought down the entire grid in eastern United States and eastern Canada. The two countries work together to share resources, to share the opportunities. And we have an opportunity now with the new technologies that are allowing sort of development of oil and gas exploration in the Bakken, North Dakota, in Canada, in the oil sands area of Alberta, to really develop an independence, energy independence for North America. And then as Mexico comes online, as it sort of frees up its regulation around oil and gas exploration in Mexico, there's an opportunity where you change the dynamic paradigm of energy in the world from having been becoming an importer of energy into North America to really becoming a self-sufficient. And that's one of the real sort of goals for our foreign policy. So one of the big things we talk about is partners in energy and in electricity. And Canada has rapidly, over the years, been moving away from a source of electricity that emit greenhouse gases. Getting more and more reliance on hydropower. There's fewer and fewer nuclear plants, actually. I think Ontario is really now the only province that really has a high dependency on nuclear energy. More and more on hydro, renewables like wind and solar, getting that. So phasing out coal-fired plants. So really moving into a system where we can somehow emit clean energy and utilize it. So, and as you can see, as you talked about, the electricity system is really very integrated. It's really, and in this part of the world, there's operators that sort of balance the power, that draw power from Canada into the United States when it's needed, and vice versa, working together to make sure that we're really balanced. And it is, and as you said, you can see on the side that $2 billion worth of electricity is exported into the US every year, or in 2012. The other part is on oil and gas, and Canada supplies, now it's by far the largest supplier, external supplier of oil and gas, of crude oil into the United States. It's 30% of US crude oil imports come from Canada, and currently that comes through 70 oil and gas pipelines. So currently across the Canada-US border, you can sort of see them sort of outlined there. It's a network that's been developed over the years, and it works very well, very efficiently. There will be a 71st one, the number 71, which is called KXL, which will eventually go through South Dakota when you get, and touch wood, it gets a presidential permit. But it is the nature of the energy system that we now have the capacity to really become an integrated, self-sufficient source for energy. Now, one of the things that you always hear about when you talk about energy, Alberta, our biggest source of Alberta is by far the biggest reservoir for energy in Canada, and as you can see on the graphic there, essentially Alberta, i.e. Canada, it has the third largest proven oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. It is that big. It's mainly in Alberta. There are pockets, of course, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and other pieces, but really they're quite tiny compared to what's available in Alberta. And then, of course, what's not there, but which is rapidly growing, is the energy availability in the United States. So when you think of that, in about sort of 5 to 10 years, that graph will look very different. Suddenly see the United States right up there in the sort of leadership roles, even possibly overtaking Saudi Arabia one day. And then Canada up there as well. So, and then Mexico coming up as it sort of figures out how to develop its energy supplies in a sustainable, environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable way. So the dynamic really changes, and I think that is one of the the pieces, policy pieces that are going to be of critical importance in North America, not just for the United States to think through, but for Canada and Mexico. How do we kind of manage this kind of thing? What policy pieces do we need to put in play? That's where things like the World Affairs Councils really come into play. It's to help those kinds of conversations and think them through. Because your thoughts, in many ways, help inform your conversations with your political leaders, with your opinion makers, within the business community, the political community, to help shape that. So it is a very important role to play. Oh, I never get this right, eh? So oil sands, right? And you've heard a lot about oil sands, and that they are very big. But just to put it in perspective, what you have on this map, this is of course a map of Canada. The green is the boreal forested area. This is the forest of Canada, if you like. And in the prairies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, the kind of county color, that's sort of agricultural land, that's sort of prairies, grassland, kind of similar to here. British Columbia is mainly rock, but there are nice pockets of agriculture there. But that's the extent of Canada's boreal forest. It is huge. It's one of the biggest forests, boreal existing forests in the world, and it's managed in a very sustainable way. And then when you put it in comparison with the oil sands in Alberta, what you can see what you can see here is the oil sands. So this is Alberta, and this is about Alberta is about sort of just almost 3 times as big as South Dakota is here, right? And the oil sands deposits are this kind of area with a kind of a yellowish line around them. That's the entire oil sands deposits. What's being exploited now or looked at now is this sort of area in here. It's quite a small part, and a lot of it is actually because a lot more and more of it is being extracted from deep underground. So it needs technologies that are somewhat similar to fracking technologies that you get in North Dakota extract Barton oil. Open pit mining is still there, but that's a kind of a finite thing. As you extract those resources, it becomes uneconomic to use open pit mining for those. So it's a huge resource, but in the context of Canada, in the context of the landmass, it's a very contained area. So just put it in perspective of this is South Dakota, of course, right? In perspective of South Dakota. Alberta is sort of roughly about just over 250,000 square miles. North Dakota is about 76,000 square miles. So Alberta is about 3 times the size of you guys. And if you overlay the oil sands, actual oil sands area, it will be this sort of red line coming around there. So it's a good chunk of South Dakota would be under oil sands, almost 3/4 of it. 2/3 to 3/4 of it. What's the area that's surface mineable is this sort of area that's shaded. And then what would be ultimately disturbed land would be this sort of area, which is this sort of green area. What's happening more and more is moving away from open pit mining, which is the kinds of things you see a lot of, into what's called steam-assisted injection technologies. That sort of essentially you shoot steam down into the reservoir. You essentially heat up the oil. It becomes liquid, much more liquid, less viscous. It flows and flows up. Somewhat similar akin to fracking, what fracking does in the shell deposits in North Dakota. But those kinds of areas have a very small footprint, because essentially they're a few hectares, acres of land, where you have where you have sites where you're putting wells in, just like in North Dakota. And for every area that's disturbed, in Alberta, and indeed in Canada, Canadians have a very high regard for the environment. The environment it's really part of Canada's values. It's part of how we view ourselves, of a country with a land of lakes and rivers and forests and things. And it's very highly valued, and Canadians do not want to see that destroyed. So the standard that Canadians expect the governments to do are very high. So in doing this, Alberta has some of the most stringent regulations in the world around environmental, making sure all of these are done. So for every area that's disturbed, there has to be a very rigid and rigorous reclamation plan to reclaim that land. And those are monitored very closely. They're part of the approval process. Nothing can be approved until that's sort of done, and that there's sufficient, they show that there's sufficient bonds up front or money to make sure that companies who do the disturbance fix that. It's interesting because I used to work, one of my first jobs, I'm not a diplomat, by the way. I'm sort of masquerading as a diplomat. I spent most of my time working in agriculture. I'm a soil scientist by background, and one of my first jobs in Canada after teaching in McGill, we moved out to Western Canada to Alberta. And the first job I had was in something called land reclamation, which is essentially going up and seeing if there were problems in reclaiming land left by an oil company from a pipeline or an oil line, and figuring out how they should fix it. Because until it was fixed and then reclaimed to the same capacity, land capacity as before, a company would have to keep paying. No company wants to do that. And what you find is that farmers would, at the time most of the exploration was on agricultural land, farmers would hold oil companies to very high standards. Just like here, right? No farmer, I mean, if you know any farmers in South Dakota, I'm sure they'll tell you no farmer will want to see, if your land is growing 50 bushes of wheat and the oil company comes in, believes and it only grows 20, they'll be pretty upset, right? They'll want to make sure it grows at least 50 again. So that's the kind of standard that people are expecting. And if people find companies aren't living up to that if you like, the social license to operate, the moral authority to operate will just disappear. That is the sort of ethic or the sort of value system in Canada that people really hold very dear. So as I talked about sort of environment, so really we are very committed to the environment. It's really one of our key attributes that Canadians is part of how we think of ourselves as people from that we call ourselves a true north, strong and free from the north. But really a land of fresh air, lakes, lots of open space, and an outdoors country, as well as being a pretty cold country sometimes. Right? So as part of that, the Canada over the years have been really committed to figuring out ways of promoting green infrastructure, energy efficiency, clean technologies, cleaner energies, and putting in stricter and stricter regulations to reduce greenhouse gases. So for example, just now, in the United States, the EPA is putting in some draft regulations on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired gas plants in the United States. Those regulations essentially mirror what's already in place in Canada and has been in place in Canada for quite some years. So essentially that means that there's a real desire to reduce, change behaviors, reduce the way you create greenhouse gases, decreasing the emissions of greenhouse gases. And I worked a lot in agriculture, so for example, looking at all the way to looking at new ways of, in terms of feed for animals, reduce greenhouse gases from fractions, etc., emissions from cows, to better ways of using, putting in fertilizer to minimize the loss of nutrients, nitrogen predominantly, that causes greenhouse gases when it's doing fertilizer. Looking at ways of becoming more efficient. And the key is that we found that has to work. The only way to do it is to make sure you do it in a way that makes sense, it makes economic sense for people, and provides compelling outcome. If you don't, people don't change, and it's how to help them. So a lot of my time when I used to work in Agriculture Canada was really coming up with technology and helping people do that in a way that also made sense for them economically, because the last thing you want to do is make a change that will put somebody out of business or make them bankrupt, because nobody's going to do that. It's got to be ways you have to transition, develop the tools, and once that happens, people do change. You know, and I used to see it when I worked in soil conservation years ago, how people change the technologies to essentially come up with technologies like zero-till, conservation tillage that really do conserve the soil. So as I said, we talked about that, and but also, as I said, we have a lot of land, and we're also very conscious of protecting that land in terms of investments in growing our protected areas, our national parks areas, marine parks, really taking lots of land out of production to maintain those lands for everyone into the future. Then finally, so if you think about that, so friends, neighbors, and allies. So the two countries share very similar allies. We work together, we help each other in terms of and because we share a common continent, right? So there's a real emphasis to work together to make sure that this continent, North America, Canada, and the United States, is kept safe and secure. So our military agencies, our law enforcement agencies, our governments work very closely together to share information, develop new ideas, new policies, new ways of doing things to work together. It's not unusual. So, for example, down in Nebraska, you had the strategic command sort of base there. There's quite a few Canadians there. And at any one time, you might have a Canadian leading that, or an American working in Canada leading it. It's that sort of work together that becomes second nature for the two countries. And then finally, so what we do is, so as I talked about, so as friends, neighbors, and allies, our role really for us in Canada is to really maintain that friendship, maintain our relationships as neighbors, maintain our relationships as allies. So the role really does become, how do you help maintain that? It's about growing our economy to make sure Canada is prosperous, because that means if you can do that, it also means helping in many ways the US economy maintain prosperity, because a lot of the goods that we use come from the United States, and that is produced, so that means through jobs. We also work very closely to understand some of the issues that happen in the United States that might have an impact on Canada. What are those? Understand those, and advocate or outline Canada's perspective on those kinds of positions. We will also, of course, help, just like any diplomatic service does, help Canadians who run into trouble. Most frequently, that is, they lose their passport and all of a sudden they're in a place and they don't have a passport. We can help them. We can provide, provide sort of ways you can get out of the country. We also help people, should they ever run into trouble with the law, hopefully they don't, but should they ever run into trouble with the law, our role is to actually help and make sure that they receive the rights they do. In a place like the United States, that's not really a problem, because they will, but in other countries, that is a significant issue, and you have to really make sure that, and every country does that. So our representation, as I say, I'm in Minneapolis, and we have covered 5 states for the upper Midwest. Because the relationship is so important, there's about 10 or 11 officers like ourselves. We cover the United States, but essentially we do the same kind of role, but in those kinds of areas. And our role really is to explain Canada, interact with Americans, whether it's at the political level with governors or state legislators, federal politicians, to university people, to business communities, interact with people. People like yourselves talk about Canada, help explain the relationship, work with businesses to grow that relationship. And it's a very fun, interesting job, because I get to sort of come and meet people like yourselves. And then finally, to sort of lead up the discussion, I thought I'd put up, so I asked you what were the 2 important national phrases that differentiate Canada and the US from one another, but also ultimately sort of define a relationship. Does anyone want to guess?
Sorry.
Sorry? Okay. So here we go. So the first one I found is, so in the United States, the 3 defining the phrase is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's really, if you think about it, that really does define the United States. And the one that really defines Canada is peace, order, and good government. and they're both really valuable and strong phrases, right? And they're both really admirable phrases. But you know, and what I find really intriguing by coming to the United States, I really kind of see Canada from a different light as well, because you're outside looking in, but you can really tell that difference. That Canadians are all about peace and order. They're typically very peaceful people. We like order. We will queue up and wait patiently. We have a strong sense of fair play. And if somebody does something wrong, we'll get upset, right? But we're pretty peaceful, and we want things to run. We're comfortable and happy. You know, as long as we have something good, things function for us. Whereas Americans are really, let's go, let's get happy, right? And it's really admirable, right? And what is an amazing thing about the United States, I noticed, is